Hi, Year 13. The focus for this lesson is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So we're coming all the way to the end now of our topic. And the first thing I'd like to do is to have a think of what can you see in this image, and if that's really simple, if you can identify, for example, the two key people in the middle of the photo, have a think about the challenge question. What does it suggest about the significance of the US Civil Rights Act? So just pause the video now, take the time to write down some ideas, and then we'll check our thoughts in just a second. So hopefully you're able to recognize that there's Martin Luther King there on the right and President Andrew Johnson on the left. He was Kennedy's vice president who was sworn in on Kennedy's assassination at the end of 1963. This was a huge piece of legislation. Some people have called it the most important in American history in the 20th century. And it is the focus for this lesson. Now, just looking at that image, you might have thought of some of the ways that the Civil Rights Act was significant. So, for example, you could have considered that ultimately the civil rights movement depended on presidential support. You could also think that this represented a kind of victory for Martin Luther King's ideas and his personal relationships and his significance as a leader, because he does seem to come across as very important to Johnson. And you'll find out through your reading and your research of that's also very true as well. So I'll be analysing the significance of the Civil Rights Act in this lesson, and I really want you to think about that particular concept. If you've got any other ideas whatsoever about what this image suggests, or any questions, then please add them to the Microsoft Teams on the chat page. So let's have a think about the big idea for today's lesson. The US Civil Rights Act was passed 100 years after the American Civil War, which ended slavery. Martin Luther King called it the second emancipation, suggesting it was very important for the true freedom of Black Americans. A century after they'd been freed from slavery, the idea was that they still needed truly freeing, and the Civil Rights Act delivered on that. Other popular interpretations also describe it as bringing a legal end to segregation and racial discrimination in the USA. So your textbook is very complimentary about it as well. Popular websites like history.com also speak very highly of it. So the question is, why was it seen as so important? That is your challenge for today's lesson. And if you're really thinking critically, another question for you is, if it was so pivotal, why was further legislation passed a year later and in 1968 through the Voting Rights Act and the Housing Act? Clearly, it wasn't a perfect piece of legislation. You may still argue that it was incredibly important and positive. So, what are some key questions that you might seek to answer? At the very basic level, you should be able to identify the reasons why it was or wasn't important. So, for example, it officially banned segregation. You should be able to give some basic knowledge as well of who was involved. For example, we've just mentioned there President Johnson. These are the types of things that you can all expect to do in exam conditions as well. As we go further up, at level 5, level of understanding might be able to explain various ways it was significant, both positive and negative. You should also be able to explain why Martin Luther King and President Johnson were important to the passing of the Act with some detailed knowledge. So we've just touched on that in the first image that we've seen. Can you actually explain their roles with a little bit of detail? And lastly, if we're aiming for the very top marks, try to reflect on the significance of the Act within a broader historical context. So think about what came before and what came after. And I'd encourage you to go all the way back to the start of the Civil Rights Movement. But even if we zoom right out thinking about the significance of this within the context of the end of slavery and anything that you know about what happened afterwards. I'd also expect you to show specific balanced knowledge. So, for example, commenting on specific titles of the Act. So what that means is that the Act actually had 11 titles, it had 11 different parts to it. And one of the things you're going to do is watch a video about that. So using that type of knowledge is really going to impress in exam conditions. And similarly, the contributions and limitations of these different key figures involved as well. Okay, just a little bit of background knowledge for you. Kennedy became president in 61, the youngest president in American history at this time. There's a lot of optimism. It was one of the reasons for the Freedom Riders, going out down south to test the transport legislation. But Kennedy's presidency really hadn't delivered on the promise that some people had hoped, which was civil rights legislation. So in '63, he felt a lot more pressure following the March on Birmingham. If you remember, television cameras showed the world how brutal the police were in the South. And eventually Kennedy was almost forced into going onto TV and proposing the idea of new civil rights legislation. An indication of just how severe the resistance was in the South, this kind of white racist resistance, was the fact that even after Kennedy's public support for the civil rights movement on June 11th, a day later, a key member of the civil rights movement was murdered, and it showed the kind of the level of challenge. You might remember that obviously that we've looked at the March on Washington as well in 1963, where Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. But the assassination of Kennedy left a big question mark over what would happen with this this Civil Rights Act that was being debated in Washington. A lot of people thought Johnson would be more cautious and hesitant. He hadn't spoken publicly in favour of civil rights. However, that being said, he actually proved himself arguably to be even more positive for the civil rights movement than what Kennedy had been, and his name will become famous for passing two very important civil rights acts in '64 and then in '65. We mentioned the Freedom Summer last lesson, but the 2nd of July 1964 is when the big Civil Rights Act was signed, and that is the focus for today's lesson. So I'll leave you here. This is your task for today, is to focus on the significance of the Civil Rights Act. I would like to watch a video that you can link to here, and then go on to the Flipgrid that you should be able to see on the Microsoft Teams. It's been linked to at the top of the tab, but it's also on the assignment, and to discuss the ways that you think this act was significant. I'd like to plan your answer first, because I'd expect you to give 3 to 5 specific ways that it was significant. It was important. It was important at the time. Maybe it affected many people in many different ways. It brought change. Maybe you could reflect even more deeply and think about what this meant within the broader context as well. If you're looking to build your knowledge up, then you can also look on these pages in your textbook. You can look on the history.com website as well. If you've got any questions, please post them on the Microsoft team, and I really look forward to seeing your responses. I'll be replying to them all.